Tonight, it's all about technology. And I was just reflecting on the fact that if we were already on the brink with technology being so involved in our lives, it now seems that it's completely taken over. But of course, it's a great blessing. There's a tremendous blessing in technology, and it's playing a crucial role at this time. The man to tell us more about it is our very own Saul Klein, who amongst his many talents and within his tremendous humility, is on the Council of Science and Technology, a group of experts that advises the Prime Minister on issues relating to science and technology, and they're involved in some of the decisions behind the scenes that are taking place at this time and how technology is being used in our country to battle the coronavirus. So the way this will work is that Saul will start off with some introductory remarks, telling us a little bit about the council. He'll highlight key areas that technology is being used. And then the third section will be for you to pose questions, which Saul will be happy to discuss. Without further ado, Saul, the microphone is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ellie. And hi, everyone. I'm just gonna, I guess, talk briefly, at least from a, my very sort of narrow perspective, what I've seen going on in relation to technology and the government's response to the crisis. I think we're all experiencing this ourselves, but things are changing very rapidly and moving very fast. So, what I've seen in the last 6 weeks may not be relevant even in the next 6 days, but I'll try and give people a little bit of a feel for what I'm seeing. And then, I guess we can have a discussion, and I can try, answer any questions that people have or might occur to them. Get comfortable there, Bobby. Looking relaxing there. No, it's good. It's good. So just briefly, what is the Council for Science and Technology? I'm actually just figuring it out myself. It's a body that's been around for a while. Basically what it does is it's a group of scientists and technologists who advise the Prime Minister on science and technology policy, hence the Council for Science and Technology. It's mainly, to be honest, scientists, people who are in senior positions at various universities around the country or research institutes like the Royal Society. And the purpose of the organization, as I said, is to really take a bird's eye view on science and technology policy and how science and technology can be used both at the central level, i.e., for the Prime Minister and Downing Street and the Cabinet Office, but then also in the various departments across government, from the Home Office to DEFRA, which is to do with the food supply, to the Treasury. All of the different departments have within them what's called a chief scientific advisor. So the government has a chief scientific officer, a guy called Sir Patrick Vallance, who people probably have got familiar with in the last couple of months. He's been on TV a lot, trying to articulate and explain the science behind the virus and the government's response to it. Patrick is the chief scientific officer. He reports to the Prime Minister, and then every department within government has a chief scientific advisor whose role it is to advise that Department of Energy, Department of Transport, on science and technology policy, and to make sure that each department within government has the best most up-to-date, forward-looking approach to science and technology. So that's what the chief scientific advisor and do. It's what the chief scientific officer does, Patrick. And the council is a group outside of government of, as I said, mainly scientists, but a few technologists who advise the government from a kind of an external perspective on how to sort of think about some of the issues and the challenges that the government or various departments are facing, and how science and technology could play a role. So that is what it does. I don't know if that's clear. You know, happy to answer more questions that people have on that if they have. But as I said, it's something that I'm relatively new to. I think it's a 3-year appointment. It's an appointment made by the Prime Minister. And, you know, so far, because I'm relatively new to it, actually only had one meeting. The meeting happened about 10 days before, you know, the government, at least from a technology side, started to really think about the role that tech could play in relation to COVID. And to give you some perspective on that, you know, obviously the government's first priority when it came to the role that technology and science could play in relation to the current COVID crisis is that how could technology and science play a role supporting the NHS, because obviously the NHS is at the front line of the country's response to the crisis. And, you know, I guess the challenge that was set by Simon Stevens, who runs the NHS, was, you know, try focus on two things. One, how can technology take pressure off the NHS? Because obviously there was an awareness that, you know, as more people in the country become infected or are exposed to the virus, you know, the demands on the NHS were going to increase exponentially. There was a fear, and I'm talking now 6 weeks ago, which seems like 6 years ago, that, you know, the NHS would not be able to cope with what, you know, we would think of as the second wave. You know, right now we're in the first wave of the crisis. And certainly 6 weeks ago, and there's been some discussion of this in the press, you know, part of the thinking in government was if you flatten the curve too hard initially, as had happened in China, you know, there was a concern that in the second half of the year, more specifically autumn and winter, when a second wave may emerge, you know, that is the time of the year where the NHS would be at its weakest. And the idea was, you know, how can technology take pressure off the NHS, firstly, and then secondly, how can technology and data support vulnerable populations? And I guess, you know, I've only kind of learned in the last 6 weeks, you know, all of the different designations of, you know, what vulnerable is, what shielded is, etc. And so really the first challenge that the technology industry, the big tech companies, the health tech companies, the ones that have, you know, tech companies focused on healthcare, and then startups were set is, how do you help take pressure off the NHS? And really the challenge there was, you know, we're all familiar with, or had been familiar maybe with, you know, remote healthcare, telemedicine, etc. but it hadn't really been, I'd say, for most of us, you know, a part of our regular healthcare experience. You know, we would go to the doctor's surgery, we would go to A&E, and that would be how we would experience healthcare. Really what Simon Stevens was saying is, all of the things we'd like to do in the next 5 years, we need to get done in the next 5 weeks, or actually in the next 5 days. And so, you know, there was this sense that the organizations that the NHS had put in place, specifically NHSX, which many of you will know or remember Matthew Gould, who was, you know, the former Israeli UK ambassador to Israel, and most recently in the last year or so, he was appointed the CEO of NHSX. NHSX is sort of the NHS, or the Department of Health and Social Care's really digital transformation organization, and Matthew Gould is the CEO and has been in charge of that. So really the ball was passed to Matthew by Matt Hancock, who is the Secretary of State for Health, and by the PM and by Simon Stevens to say, okay, Matthew, your job is to kind of digitize the NHS. You thought you had 5 years, now you've got 5 weeks, basically. And he's done an incredible job. He's an amazing person. I think a lot of you know him and know that. But he really sort of, you know, was responsible for then trying to marshal the resources of the technology industry, big tech companies, you know, the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles of this world, you know, like our friends, the Rosenthal's would know. I see James, what is that pot noodle you're having there? Maybe.
Different times.
Yeah, there you go. Ramen. Basically, the big tech companies have been incredibly helpful. Many of them already work with and support the NHS, NHSX, for example. Amazon's web services runs all of the NHS's websites. Amazon provides the infrastructure for, you know, the NHS's call centers. Google's company DeepMind does all sorts of great work with the NHS. Microsoft is a big infrastructure provider to the NHS, etc. So, you know, Matthew was sort of not just responsible for helping try to include all of those big companies in the response, but encourage, you know, healthcare specific companies and then startups to really kind of lend their support. And I mean, we can go more into that in a second. So if people want or are interested. So obviously the way that tech can help is around healthcare. And the first priority, the first agenda item was take pressure off the NHS, you know, digitize as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And I'm sure those of you who have needed to have any kind of interaction with healthcare providers in the last 4 to 6 weeks, most of you would have done that either through SMS or your mobile phone or through a video consultation. All of those were technologies that existed 6 weeks ago. Now they've gone from being used by maybe 20 or 30% of the population to, in some cases, you know, every GP surgery in the country are now using these types of technologies. So that was sort of point number one that Simon Stevens was focused on, is like help take pressure off the system. You know, if people absolutely need to access the system, ICU, etc., obviously we need the beds. So help people take pressure off the system. Number two was the recognition that, you know, there are millions of vulnerable people in the country, you know, some who are being shielded, others who would fall into vulnerable categories. And, you know, that would be not just age related, as became the case as we moved into lockdown, but also obviously people who are more vulnerable from a kind of an economic or socioeconomic standpoint. And then the challenge was, how do you use technology to support those types of populations? And in a sense, it's a more complicated challenge because a lot of the burden of care for vulnerable populations falls into two areas. One would be local authorities, like, you know, in our case, or Camden or Barnet, or, you know, councils. And then secondly, on charities, who are often, you know, at the front line of supplementing, supporting, you know, care in the community and supporting vulnerable people in the community. And then obviously, you know, there is more generally civic society, synagogues, churches, mosques, etc. So there's kind of councils and civic society, neither of whom are famously well integrated with the sort of the national agenda. And so, you know, it was actually, the challenge there was, how do you sort of deliver support at a local level, identifying, first of all, how do you identify vulnerable people? And then secondly, what services do vulnerable people need that, you know, technology companies could help provide or facilitate? So, you know, some easy examples there would be, you know, let's assume you can identify vulnerable people. You know, how do you get food to people's houses, you know, because they can't go out? How do you get medical supplies to people's houses? How do you support people from a mental health perspective through isolation? And so all of those issues, you know, and what we chose to do was, you know, doing this at a national level is incredibly complicated, was to focus on doing some work with Camden and the council leader there, Georgia Gould, to how do you sort of deliver some of these services to vulnerable populations. So working, say, with Uber and Deliveroo to deliver food and care packages or medical supplies to vulnerable people. Working with Amazon, who have, you know, Echo Dots, the little Alexas that people might have in their home, or they may have Google Homes, to put that into the homes of more vulnerable populations who may not either have access to the internet or be uncomfortable using a computer or phone, to use voice as a way of, like, not just being connected, but, you know, reducing loneliness. So those were sort of the two initial challenges. I think what became evident fairly quickly was that, you know, while the challenges around healthcare are profound and significant, you know, there are other very, very big challenges, basically in every other part of the economy, you know, where tech can play a role. So, you know, one of them is around food and the food supply chain. To give you an example here, you know, most restaurants in the country have shut down in the last 6 to 8 weeks. Now, you know, that has a huge knock-on effect on a number of different things. The most obvious knock-on effect is that I think there are about 1.7-2 million people who are employed in restaurants. Now, you know, all of those people either were going to lose their jobs or be furloughed. So, you know, what do you do with those, you know, 1.5 to 2 million people who are working in restaurants? And there are various sort of solutions that have been developed around that, some involving technology, some not. And then, you know, the other question is that a big part of the food supply chain is tied up with getting food into restaurants. And if the restaurants aren't ordering the food, it's not because people don't want to eat, it's because people can't or don't want to go to a restaurant. So there are some ways of keeping restaurants alive, and restaurants have kind of, in some cases, been repurposed to supply meals to the NHS. There are a number of initiatives going on there, some charitable initiatives, raising money for meals to the NHS, providing businesses, local businesses, with local restaurants with the chance of, you know, still making an income by making food and ordering food, but supplying food specifically to the NHS or NHS workers. And then there have also been restaurants that have converted themselves into grocery stores, because they can still, you know, order from their suppliers, but, you know, they've kind of repurposed themselves to still stay in business. So, you know, the restaurant sector, the food supply chain is another area where technology has been involved. Obviously, education. All of us probably have kids or grandkids who are now, you know, going through being the canaries in the coal mine for a mass remote learning experiment that's going on around the world. This is true at primary schools, at secondary schools. It's true for colleges, so it's true for MBA programs. You know, all of the universities in the country have had to figure out how do they deliver their services remotely and using technology, and how do they then, you know, justify to students tuition fees. How do they attract foreign students in the future, which is sort of a huge part of their income? So, you know, a lot of the tech companies have massively, as they have done in healthcare, accelerated or supported the accelerated adoption of remote learning and digital learning. Charities, I've mentioned, you know, charities have been very hard hit by COVID. You know, the Treasury announced a couple of weeks ago a £750 million package to help support charities who've been hard hit by COVID and really need to support those vulnerable communities. And tomorrow night, BBC, along with Comic Relief and Children in Need, is running a big fundraiser. And then sort of finally on the economic side, I think, you know, the big debate, and I'll say this and then be quiet because I feel like I've been talking for far too long. And Bobby's looking, you know, he's looking comfortable. But, you know, I've got, oh, Adrian is there. So the big debate I think that's happening now is, you know, on the one hand, obviously, the health service has a not just a moral obligation, but a operational obligation to keep society healthy. And then the Treasury and the business BEIS, the Business Environment Industrial Strategy Ministry, along with the Treasury, has the job of keeping the country and the economy solvent. And obviously, if people stay at home and are isolated, you know, it's putting massive, massive pressure on the economy. And so there's now also, and has been for several weeks now, a big focus on what role can technology and what role can data play in kind of bringing the economy back to life while balancing the needs of the health service. And, you know, with that, and I don't know, Adrian is on Zoom now. He may have some insights and views here. You know, there is a lot of now thinking about, on the healthcare side, what are the technologies that sort of take us out of lockdown? And people may have heard about contact tracing, you know, which has been tested in various countries like, you know, Korea and China. And Apple and Google have collaborated on an infrastructure that would facilitate contact tracing. So there's contact tracing. which would allow you to, understand who you've been in contact with, not at a personal level, but who you've been in contact with. And then, theoretically, if you became infected, having gone back into the normal world, outside of isolation, outside of lockdown, the people who you had been in contact with could be automatically notified and say, hey, Richard, you've been in contact with Saul, or not even with Saul, you've been in contact with someone, because they're also doing it in a way that preserves anonymity, and privacy is a huge issue in all of this. Richard, you've been in touch with someone who's now been tested positive, you should self-isolate. So, obviously that is something people are interested and excited about. There are lots of privacy issues around it. The second concept, which people are talking a lot about, and in the UK, they've talked about it in the terms of, they call it an immunity passport or an immunity certificate. I think increasingly that's the wrong way to think about it, but nevertheless, that's how people are talking about it. And what that is think about, I remember this as a kid, when you traveled abroad, you needed a kind of a book of vaccines, like to say, yeah, I'm okay, I can come into the country, I've had my vaccination for cholera or whatever. And think of I'm going to stop calling it an immunity passport in a minute, but think about an immunity passport as, something that says, Susan, you are okay to travel. It's okay. The grass is green on the other side of the road, and you can safely go there, and they can welcome you. So that would be an immunity passport. That's how we've been talking about it. What I think is a smarter way to think about it, the way that some of the people in the US are thinking about it, which is they think about it as proof of health. And the reason why that distinction is important is if you think about immunity, immunity is binary. You're either immune or you're not immune. And the fact is, I'm not a doctor, but no one is 100% immune. So what they're talking about with proof of health is that there is a scale, and depending on where you are on that scale, think about it like a credit score. You would have some level of proof of health. Let's call it, Dunny is 75 and Saul is 40. So the combination of proof of health and contact tracing can be very, very powerful in moving people out of isolation. The other thing, obviously, is testing. There are lots of really incredibly interesting initiatives that could be game changers when it comes to testing. Probably the most interesting one is the tests that could be, accurate. The current tests, if people know or people may have had them, are swab tests that you send it off to a lab. The likelihood that that test is accurate is around 70%, which is obviously, which is why the idea of an immunity passport is nonsense. We just don't know with the tests right now. So if there were tests that were based on genomics, i.e. DNA sequencing, they would be a lot more accurate. So if you think about accurate testing, contact tracing, and proof of health, you start to think about three different things that packaged together could start to move people out of lockdown into the community. And to the extent that they become infected, and we all have infections throughout the year or throughout the decade, you would be able to be notified, not just you, but the people who had been in contact with you, and there would be a much better, more fluid, agile way of understanding, where people should be and how they could kind of get out the house. So at this point, I'm going to be quiet, and if anyone has any questions or comments, or if people, because I know there are other people on the call who, you know, are really engaged in some of this stuff, you know, James, Adrian, others, you know, take the mic. Is that all right, Ellie?
More than all right. Thank you very much for such a wide-ranging introduction. Picks up on so many different topics. Add something. Otherwise, Q&A. Let's go. Please just unmute yourselves one at a time and take to the stage.
Hello, it's Yves.
Hi.
Hello, start video. Yeah, you can see me, maybe. Yeah, you can see me. May I ask a question? What about the testing?
What about the testing?
Yes, so what, how accurate can the testing be, and how many people can be tested, and how reliable would that be?
I mean, I will first of all give you the caveat that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical expert, and you know what I know about testing I've learned in the last 4 weeks. So I'll tell you what I know, and you know the aspect of it that I have some insight on is, you know, some of the science and some of the technology. I can, you know, say that one of the big challenges around testing, and I think Israel has done a pretty amazing job on testing, is, you know, how do you make tests widely available? And there are two aspects to that. One is cost, and the other is accessibility. So, you know, currently the way that testing is happening in the UK is through swabs, you know, that either, I guess, can be delivered to your house, or you could pick up from a doctor's surgery or from a hospital. That swab is then sent off to a lab, you know, central labs, and then the results are processed. It takes, I don't know, 3 days, 5 days, you get the result back. And as I understand it, these tests, and if other people know more about this, please jump in, called PCR tests, you know, are not that much more than 71% accurate. Therefore, and actually the other thing I've been told is that you may test negative, and then if you retest 2 weeks later, you may test positive. So, you know, the bottom line with the test, which is why the idea of an immunity passport or an immunity certificate is a nonsense, and why proof of health is a much better way of thinking about this, is that the tests that currently exist, however ubiquitous they are, however cheap they are not that accurate, or at least they're not 100% accurate. If we can get to a place, and I'll just show you guys, share my screen for 1 second. Oh, hosted disabled screen sharing. But
hang on, let me make that possible for you.
There's a company in Oxford.
You can share now, Saul.
Okay.
You can share.
Thanks. Now, hopefully, I'm not sharing anything really bad. There we go. Can people see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a British company based in Oxford called Oxford Nanopore Technologies. They make I'll show you, a pocket-sized, this is literally the size of a mobile phone, DNA sequencing device. It costs around $2,000 compared to the traditional kind of DNA sequencing devices that cost millions of dollars. And these guys were being used, I mean, if you go back to January, they were sequencing the virus in Wuhan for the Chinese CDC back in January. Now, you know, companies like this are working on COVID-specific tests that could potentially be, you know, because it's DNA, you know, incredibly accurate. But, you know, this is new technology. The technology was not developed for this purpose. And so, you know, companies like this are saying, okay, well, how do we repurpose our technology to sort of, you know, really help both in the accessibility of testing, because, you know, every GP surgery, you know, could have a device like that. They're also, you know, looking at how do we make these tests much more accurate or specific. So, you know, but there is a big debate going on at the moment. I mean, between, you know, the tests that we know are available, the PCR swab tests, how do we get enough of these tests, like millions of these tests, so we can do the 100,000 per day or whatever it is that Matt Hancock has talked about. And then there is the issue of, you know, actually processing the test results and getting accurate test results. So there are lots of issues around testing, but at the same time, there's some really promising technologies and solutions that could help.
Okay,
So I don't know
thank you.
if that's useful.
Yes, very much. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Do you want to keep that up on the screen, Saul?
Yeah, I
Stop
can
sharing.
for now, if you like, because there might be something else. That's,
Sure.
I'm happy to switch it off if you prefer. There you go.
I asked a question in the chat box.
Who's this?
It's
My
just-
sister.
It is, sorry, hi.
You actually know what you're talking about.
No, I really don't, but I just wondered how a health, what did you call it, proof of health, how is that different from an immunity passport? Would it include various other measures of health? And then obviously that relies on testing in itself, you know, to have proof of health, you're going to need accurate testing. And then I've heard people say, so I'm not necessarily saying my own thoughts here, but that would this not create a two-tier society? I'm healthy, you're not, etc., etc.
Yeah. Firstly, the reason why I think proof of health is a better framing than anything that includes the word immunity is because it's proof of health is non-binary. It's not, you know, you're immune or you're not immune. And you don't have to be a scientist to know that there is no such thing as perfect immunity. And there's no such thing as someone who is, you know, susceptible to everything. So, you know, proof of health is just changing the dynamic from a binary distinction between immune, not immune, to say we need to think about a range and a scale. Now, once you accept that health is a range, it's not healthy or not healthy, then you get into all of the issues that you described, which is how, you know, how do you say someone is healthy or they're not healthy? What are the metrics that you use? You know, is it observation? Is it behavioral? You know, is it and this is not an Apple Watch, it's my 29 quid Amazon watch, but is it your Fitbit? Is it your Apple Watch that's sort of streaming live data to some service in the cloud that's running safe algorithms that Adrian and the Turing Center have vetted, you know, to make sure that the data is anonymized, et cetera, et cetera? How do you ensure fairness? And I mean, this is sort of a can of worms that COVID or no COVID we were dealing with anyway when it comes to personal data or medical data, machine learning, AI, etc. But again, this is going to accelerate the discussion. And that's why, you know, people in the US who are sort of thinking about this stuff are saying, you know, what are the three interesting issues right now? One is contact tracing, two is proof of health, and three is privacy.
But I would also add the socioeconomic divide, because I can see that getting wider, because all the things that you're describing are easier perhaps for more affluent people to, you know, be able to prove about themselves. I don't know if the widening inequality.
I mean, there's no, like, you know, there are no silver bullets to this. And I think people are definitely aware of those issues. One of the most interesting ideas I've heard there, you know, is something that Camden is considering. You know, I'd heard about universal basic income. I don't know if people have heard about the concept. I'd not heard about universal basic service. And what Camden is talking about is, you know, what are the services that people use, you know, that make a difference economically or to their life chances. And one of the basic services is transport. So, you know, what if you basically, you know, gave people the ability to travel for free? How would that change their life circumstances? So I think all of this, the behavioral science, the economic incentive structures, the social protection mechanisms that need to be in place for all of this stuff to scale out at nation level are like really profound. But again, just like Simon Stevens said, you know, I need you to figure this out, Matthew, in 5 weeks, not 5 years. You know, if we take 5 years to figure this stuff out, we'll all still be in lockdown. Adrian, have you got anything on this? Because I'm sure you've thought about it a lot.
Hi, Saul. First, great overview. It was really interesting and really helpful. So specifically on this issue of how we can use these technologies to try to come out of lockdown, is that the question?
Well, I know you've done a lot of work and thinking at the Turing about fairness and AI. So, you know, in a world where basically, you know, now not out of choice, but out of necessity, we're sharing data so we can kind of be economically, you know, so we can be part of society. You know, how does sort of technology, privacy enhancing technologies, AI, you know, play a role in that? Because I mean, I know that's kind of a lot of what you spend time thinking about at the Turing.
So it's a great question, and Mel's observation is also a very important one. Big picture, I would agree with what you said, Saul, and add a bit to that, which is we need to recognize that right now everybody is in lockdown. We've all got our civil liberties really heavily curtailed, and all governments around the world are trying to figure out how we can get beyond this to try and free up as many of us as possible without endangering lives. And there are lots of different aspects to that. Some of them are based on technology, and some of them, as Saul was saying, are not about technology. And some of them are about getting PPE and getting ventilators and things like that, which are really important. But in terms of trying to figure out good ways to enable us to come out of lockdown, there's a whole menu of different potential measures, and it's going to be really interesting as we see different countries try different things. One of the things which we know is very likely to be helpful is testing and tracing, so that we can try to, instead of having everyone locked down, hopefully have people who are mostly healthy out and about, and if people get sick, to ask them to stay inside, and then people that they come into contact with stay inside. And that's a process which has been used for many years successfully, even before technology, just by trying to find people who are sick and then and calling around. So it's traditionally been a very human heavy thing to do. Now we have the capability to try to do something like that with technology, which we hope will be helpful. There's a lot of discussion around this for good reason. There are concerns about privacy, which in some ways are well placed, and we can talk more about that if people are interested. In some ways, perhaps it's less of a concern than you might think, because there are clever techniques you can use, which Saul mentioned, various privacy preserving approaches to a decentralized way of handling this, where all you do is find out if you've been close to someone who might have had it, rather than any kind of centralized system and anyone being able to check anything about you. There's the potential to do that, but there's also potential for there to be some mission creep, so that it does involve other things.
Well, I mean, the other issue for that is, you know, as someone in the US pointed out, you know, if you can heat map areas where people are infected, even though if you don't know people, you know, that's the world of lynch mobs.
You're right. It's also a world where you could direct resources more effectively to deal with places where you might. Yeah. So there are a lot.
This is the balance, right?
There are a lot of difficult and interesting policy issues here, and different things to weigh up. And how much do you care about controlling the outbreak versus freedoms? And Mel raised a really good point. Things, particularly, some of these issues will affect certain people more than others. Some people won't have phones at all, and that's part of the picture. And I think it's really useful to have this kind of discussion, to have people talking about this, and we should be as transparent as possible. I think government should be as transparent as possible about what it's trying to do, why, how, what measures it's using. So all that's good.
Can I ask a question? It's Wendy Filer.
Hi, Wendy.
To what extent, if at all, are the scientists and technologists informed by discussions with ethicists or philosophers in relation to these very deep and difficult issues that you are grappling with? Because these are not simply technological issues, it seems to me. They impact on our fundamental values of our society. And one would have thought that people with different skills may have different ways in which those skills can inform the way in which technologists and scientists can reach an acceptable outcome, taking all the various factors into account.
Definitely. I mean, it's a great question. And I think, you know, one of the great misnomers of you know, the Council for Science and Technology is that everyone focuses on the kind of the hard sciences, and, you know, a massive role in all of this obviously is the soft sciences. And a number of people, members of the council, just specifically talking about the council, are social scientists, behavioral scientists, ethicists, etc. You know, again, just to mention the Turing Institute, where Adrian is a part of, you know, there is a center for data ethics. So, you know, if you look at the jobs on Google's websites or on Facebook's websites, you know, tech companies are hiring ethicists. You know, they're not that many. I think they're probably about 120,000 or more people who work at Google, and there are only 14 job openings that have the keyword ethics in it. But, you know, tech companies are hiring ethicists. Alain de Botton wrote a great piece probably about 8 or 9 years ago in the FT and said every public company should have a philosopher on its board, you know, because someone needs to ask the question, why do we exist and who do we exist for? So, I mean, there are absolutely people involved in these discussions that are coming from the soft sciences, not the hard sciences. It's just when we talk about science, we forget that 70% of sort of postgrads and PhDs are in the soft sciences, not the hard sciences. And actually the UK is an absolute world leader there. And the LSE, you know, is one of the world's great social science institutions, and its proudest achievement to date is helping to create the NHS. So absolutely people involved with those skill sets, having these discussions, being part of these discussions, their lawyers being part of these discussions, because there are all sorts of, you know, legal and implications around this. So it's not helping anyone maybe come up with better answers, but, you know, Patrick Vallance sort of made the point in early March, you know, COVID-19 only skipped species in December. So we're kind of like 8 weeks into this, or 10 weeks into this. So actually, I think it's pretty remarkable how rapidly people and governments and businesses and charities, how everyone has adapted, and, you know, the resilience and ingenuity that people are showing is totally remarkable. But as Adrian said, you know, we're learning, and, you know, governments are running experiments in public because they have no choice.
Saul, did you see that amazing clip from Israel of a health worker interactively examining a patient over technology? Did you come across it? Did anyone else?
I'm not sure. I've seen lots of really amazing.
It was going around a couple of weeks ago. Essentially, via a computer screen, the patient sitting at home, the health worker asked various questions, even managed to take the patient's temperature, etc. And I just wondered whether such a thing is available within the NHS, whether it's coming on stream, and also your thoughts on how we can use this technology beyond COVID, because for an elderly patient to be able to be treated like this at home in the first instance before going into the GP's practice is extremely powerful. So 2 questions really. What's available? I don't know if you haven't seen the clip, it's a little bit difficult to comment.
The first question Dunny can answer, because she did see the clip.
Okay, what's available in the NHS? And B, hopefully what can we carry forward from this time?
Firstly, Saul has seen the clip. He's just forgotten. There's too much. And in fact, you sent it to someone. But I sent it to our cousin who's on the front line in infectious diseases. And he said they are currently using it in the UK. So I don't think that's exclusive to Israel, and I presume it's around. That's all from me.
And the other question is, does this help or persist after COVID?
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, the answer is absolutely, but I think that's not just true. I mean, the big question for everyone is, you know, what happens, what is it that we've experienced or learned during this time that we take forward? And, you know, one of the things that, you know, where I mean, certainly the rapid digitization of our health service, and there's still, you know, we're only at the tip of the iceberg, but as you said, you know, most people would have found it completely unacceptable to sort of open up a Zoom and do a video consultation with their doctor. Now, most people will say, well, I don't want to walk to the doctor's surgery, you know, I'll just do this on Zoom. So, I mean, that's definitely, you know, a massive behavioral change. But I think, you know, that's going to be true in all sorts of areas. It's way too early to say, you know, what really remains. But I'm pretty sure, you know, we're human, and, you know, the things that we've experienced in the last 6 to 8 weeks that, you know, we value, have been useful, and still, you know, we could still see playing an important role in our lives, you know, we're absolutely going to retain. And, you know, I think it'll also stimulate all sorts of new ideas, you know, and people will use technology and science and behavioral science in ways that, you know, we haven't thought of so far, because again, you know, in times of constraints and times of scarcity, you know, people get very, very creative. You know, I remember one of the most memorable places that I visited during the time that we spent in Israel was Ben Gurion's house in Sde Boker. And, you know, people will know that he went there after he retired from politics, because he was inspired in the deserts, looking at the pioneers in the deserts who basically were making do with nothing, with no resources, and creating flowers in the desert, creating life in the desert. And, you know, he was an entrepreneur, and that's where he chose to spend his last years. And, you know, constraints is an incredibly powerful, creative force. So, you know, I think there are lots of things that we rapidly adopt going into COVID. Coming out of it, you know, the amount of innovation we're going to see in the next couple of years is going to be incredible.
Saul. Hi.
Hi.
Where do you think we're going to be in terms of lockdown in 4, 8, and 12 weeks' time? Based on your insights.
12. What metric are you looking for?
Lockdown.
Population still in lockdown? Which part of society is still in lockdown? Will we all still be in lockdown?
Who will be? And just based on what you're seeing.
Easy question. Easy question.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I mean, I think a lot of it's down to how successful test, trace, proof of health is. So that there's that piece, and then there's, even if you can test, you can trace, and you can prove health, I know a lot of people who are saying, I'm not going to get on a plane again. I'm not going to get on a bus again. I'm not going to get on a train again until there's a vaccine. And, you know, I know that I'm totally safe. So even if lockdown comes out, there's going to be sectors of society who just say, I don't care about test. I don't care about trace. I don't care about proof of health. I'm staying at home because Amazon works, Deliveroo works, Ocado works. You know, the shuls come to my house. You know, there's never been better TV. They're playing the Premier League behind closed doors, like, kick back. I'm not going out. So I think the huge missing elements, and, you know, Wendy, to your point, this has nothing to do with technology or science. It's got to do with behavioral economics and incentives. Is like, what is the incentive going to be to get people out? And some of that will be a forced incentive, like work, although a lot of people have figured out they can work remotely now and do it actually pretty well. You know, another one will be school, obviously, and education. But what, you know, even if you have test, trace, and proof of health, how do you get people out of the house? And to me, this is where universal basic service and, you know, actually creating a set of economic incentives for people to say, okay, you're safe, or at least you're safe enough to leave, and if something happens, we'll tell you to come back home, i.e. test, trace, and proof of health. But what is actually going to help people get out of the house? And in the same way that the Chancellor has given 330 billion stimulus to businesses, you know, was the stimulus going to be for individuals to say, you know, if you're not required to go out of the house for school, if you're not required to go out of the house because you're a key worker, why would you leave? So I don't know the answer, and I haven't answered your question, but that's kind of, I think, the key to answering your question.
Saul, how could you see the current situation transforming education? So I know it's a much larger question, but could you see schools changing the way they operate, using more technology, more home-based? Is there a discussion about that, or it's too early to tell?
Getting all the easy questions. I mean, I think, again, I have no idea, but a lot of the clues are in what's happening at the moment, and figuring out what works, what people really respond to. And, there's no doubt that the economics of delivering education didn't make sense before COVID. I don't think anyone at any level of the education system, primary, secondary, tertiary, FE, would say, oh, education, it's just awesome, So there was already a great reckoning happening for education. And I think, what's happening now, and it's happening in health, it's happening in food, it's happening in shopping and travel, we've got this kind of accelerated experience of what would the world look like if you couldn't leave your house and everything was digital. This isn't as bad as Ready Player One and we're all wearing VR, but this is what the world would look like if you couldn't leave home. And we're going to have maybe an 8-week, maybe a 12-week, maybe a 20-week experience of that. And we're going to leave that and we're going to say, what is it here that actually was fundamentally not better, but additive to the mixed experience of when we go back? And, when I'm talking to people, who are, running universities or schools, we're very involved around our office with, the local primary school and local secondary school. Most people are saying, how do we use this experience to improve delivery when we kind of get back to normal? What are the things that we want to keep? But I don't think anyone is saying, we want to stay at home forever.
Would you have an example of a company or an organization that's leading the way in education at the moment, do you think is really doing some good stuff around
hybrid education, or in terms of digital education?
I think just right now, more secondary school education, just an organization that's really getting it right in terms of the research-based teaching, and just following up with kids, obviously being at home and away from their teachers.
I mean, I honestly don't have a great answer there. I think there are a lot of companies that are doing great digital learning. I think there are a lot of educational institutions that have kind of pivoted quite fast to kind of, do a good job by their students, whether that's, like the business schools at Oxford or, LSE, and others, but I don't have a great example that I can point to of anyone who sort of figured out hybrid learning yet. But I think, again, that's why I'm really excited to see the innovation that's going to happen in the next few years, because we've all had 20, 50 years of experience of what life was like before the 8 or the 12 weeks that we all had to stay at home and figure out how to use these incredible digital tools. I mean, just take a second to appreciate that this thing, Zoom, exists. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, this didn't exist 5, 10, 15 years ago. The fact that a system that was designed to support 20 million people is now supporting 200 million people, and they had to do that in 4 weeks, is like a technical miracle. So, I mean, I just think there's no answer to your question. But, you know, if you've got good ideas, now is the best time in probably the last 30 years to figure out what a hybrid school looks like. Because everyone's going to be customers of hybrid schools in the next 20 years.
We have time for one more question. Neil, was that your hand up?
It is my hand, Ellie. Thank you. I think that's really interesting. I always come from a professional position of looking up for the digital divide. Like, we're having a discussion, and it's very, you know, in Camden and Hampstead, and we are in a community and people that do have iPads, and we do have all of these things. And I know full well that, you know, in rural areas, you can't get a mobile phone signal still. That still in 2020, the mobile phone operators have not sorted out not spots, and we don't have universal broadband, and 12.5 million people still are using Freeview as their primary television source. Not everyone is using Netflix. So I look at these things and I wonder at what point sometimes, if nothing else, politicians and government get carried away because they want to be associated with a new and exciting thing. So when I was working on Newsnight in February, I was working on a health story with them, Babylon Health, about digital health. And this was something that Secretary of State, who's a digital evangelist, and that's brilliant because he's got a DCMS background, very into artificial intelligence, AI, medical healthcare. But actually, when you spoke to doctors, they said that this is the last thing we want, is people going onto a digital chatbot to find out, are they having a heart attack or not? If you think you're ill, that's where you need a real person, not a chat box. And actually, so sometimes I wonder who's pushing what, and are they thinking in terms of everyone, or are they thinking in terms of kind of what works for a few? So.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, to put your mind at rest, I'm sure you know that in Camden, and if you just take Somerstown as an example, which is the area behind the Crick Institute and between Euston and King's Cross, 7 out of 10 kids are on social care. And so not everyone in Camden has an iPad and Netflix. And, you know, the urban-rural divide is not the economic divide. There's an economic divide if you just cross Midland Road between King's Cross and Somerstown. So I think people are absolutely aware of that. And, you know, if you look at the schools in Somerstown, Edith Neville Primary School, Regent's High Secondary School, Maria Fidelis, you know, there are kids who are at home who not just, you know, who don't have iPads, and they can't do remote learning. So, you know, maybe they have access to broadband, which they may not have in, you know, in St. Ives or somewhere else in the country. But, you know, it's very easy to kid ourselves that there aren't people literally across the road from us that don't have access to all of the things that we do. So it's not an urban-rural divide. It's like literally just walk through between King's Cross and Euston, and, you know, you will live 15 years less as an adult male in Somerstown than you will in Highgate, and it's a 15-minute walk. So I think people are absolutely painfully aware of that, and that's why the role of charities and local authorities is so critical here. You know, vis-a-vis the point about evangelism and sort of, you know, technocrats, I guess, versus humanists. You know, yes, you know, Matt Hancock, you know, really embraces and engages with technology. But I think if you now ask GPs, you know, is it helpful to you to have an SMS service that helps you to triage, you know, people's symptoms, and, you know, if they're fine, say don't worry, or if, you know, they need a consultation, it immediately switches them into a video consultation. I think not only would they say it's been life-changing and it's allowed us to really sort of optimize and focus our time, but they, you know, now that they've experienced it, they would say, what would they do without it? So look, there are obviously always going to be products, services, ideas, you know, that are not fit for purpose, that people overhype. But, you know, that's the moral of the story of innovation. You know, 8 out of 10 things you try, you'll be wrong. But I think, you know, we have to have a spirit of creativity and innovation, and accept that we're not going to be right the whole time. In fact, we're going to be wrong most of the time. But, you know, if we don't try things, albeit with, you know, as Melanie was saying, with the right protections, and Wendy was saying, thinking through the ethics and the philosophy, you know, we're just going to like never move on. So, I think we have opportunities on our doorstep to not just engage with the privileged, but to engage with the underprivileged. And again, I mean, not to go on about Camden, but you know, that is one of the great things about the mixed economy in which we live is, you know, there are levels of segregation, but none of us live more than 3 minutes walk away from someone who is at or below the breadline.
That's certainly food for thought. Much to ponder over. Saul, you have been absolutely great. And you've taken us behind the scenes. So tick that box. A brilliant start to our series. Thank you very much. Very, very grateful. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Hopefully see you again extremely soon. Why not tomorrow?
Thank you.
A virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
If anyone comes up with the economic incentives to get people out of lockdown, I'm all ears. I think that's the problem. The health stuff they'll figure out.
Yeah, it's all on that getting people outside. That's the big customer behavior point that the airline industry is questioning at the moment, and the airline industry is absolutely on its knees. Passengers have dropped by 90% in this country and pretty much in most other countries. And the big question that the airlines are facing, and those that will survive, because as every day that goes by, another airline goes into administration. It was Mauritius. 2 days ago, it was Virgin Australia. There'll be others that are following in the coming days and weeks. The big question is going to be, you know, there are 139 customer touch points on a customer journey when you leave your home and arrive at your destination. And the big question is, how is the industry going to adapt, and what is the actual demand curve going to be? And I was really interested in 2 points that you mentioned. One was the universal basic provision, and you know, the airline industry is required at this moment in time for the logistical support that it's providing in bringing the masks and the components for the ventilators and so on and so forth. But it also, for remote communities, it's a critical part of people's income and sustainability. And I don't know whether the government, I know the British government is taking a very firm stance, and rightly so, that the airline industry needs to seek for commercial support, and it will only ever consider government support as a very, very last resort. But I don't know from what you're seeing whether there's any focus that's looking at air travel in particular. And secondly, with this amazing facility that we've got as Zoom, as you're saying, just a few weeks ago, was a fraction of the people that are using it. Obviously, that's going to change behavior in terms of people's working, and need for travel is going to reduce from that. And do you see, what are the future enhancements to Zoom type of technologies that you can see coming down the line that will make international travel even less necessary in that sense? So you mentioned the virtual reality mask. Maybe next time we'll be able to, in a few years' time, have this on, but actually be able to virtually shake hands and virtually give a hug.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, we have companies that we've invested in who, are very involved in the travel industry, and, have seen revenues go to, to zero in, weeks. I guess our view would be that, and I think air travel is an interesting one, is that, it's not if, it's when people start moving again, because there are all sorts of, reasons why people need to and have to move and have to use air travel. And your point about freight, I think, is like incredibly important, is that, we focus on the consumer side of air travel and transport, but one of the most important aspects of freight and mobility is obviously the movement of goods and services, and economies absolutely rely on that. So I would expect freight to become more of an important part of the industry. And I think, quite frankly, even before COVID and climate and flight shaming, there was a movement, a consumer movement that was starting to emerge to say, do we need to fly as much as we're flying? And, people were being a lot more intentional about flights even before COVID. And now COVID is just going to sort of add another level to that. But, I think people have been exploring the world for a few thousand years now, and the urge to travel, the urge to actually not virtually but physically meet new people, smell new smells, be in new situations, that doesn't go away. I think that's a basic human need, but I think we're all going to be a lot more intentional about that. But I think that, again, that was happening anyway. And again, like education, like healthcare, we're just going through a 2, 3, 4, 5 month kind of jolt to say, what if you couldn't do this ever again? And cognitively, we'll start to just be more intentional, and we'll make tougher decisions, and we won't live in a world of cognitive abundance. We'll make choices, which we have to and we should.
Yeah, thank you. And I was thinking about the need to travel, like things like the Israel Experience Tour, or the programs that Ellie leads with taking our young people to Israel or to Europe, and so there's definitely those the way the experiential side of it that you can't get through the same way. But yes.
Yeah, but to Neil's point, what this does teach us is that a lot of the amazing experiences, that we haven't pushed ourselves to transmit digitally, we now can and should be able to make those much, much more widely available. If anyone went on Rafi Zaram's tour around the British Museum over Pesach, that would not have been possible if Google hadn't done something completely irrational in the last 10 to 15 years, which was to sort of digitally archive and map all of these cultural institutions around the world. So, I don't think, James, correct me if I'm wrong, that was driven by commercial objectives. That was driven by the fact that, they understood that, if Google is about making all information in the world accessible, culture is a huge part of that. And now literally anyone can go to the British Museum. They don't have to be in London, you know, they can be in Timbuktu. And yes, not everyone has mobile coverage in Timbuktu, but there are 4 billion people who do have mobile coverage, and 6 billion people will have mobile coverage. So, I mean, you know, just think about, you know, some of the experiences we're having for the first time are experiences people who, you know, all around the world in much, much less privileged economic situations can now have for free. I mean, or at least for the price of data and their device.
Absolutely, and that's it's absolutely amazing that we have that. The second part of mine is what are the evolutions of that are coming down the line, because it's absolutely amazing today that technology has advanced so quickly in the last couple of years.
And the bet is, if you can imagine it, it will happen. It's just a question of time and money. So
great, thank you.
Where's my
aspirational stuff there. Thanks, everybody. Richard, you put a comment in the chat box, but on both occasions you left us hanging. The sentence is incomplete.
Richard's going to do the sequel.
Unmute. Okay, apologies. So I was just actually trying to get it right. Just wanted to say, a brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it. I had a couple of comments. Firstly, I really can't share your concern that people, after spending 3 months in self-imposed solitary confinement, would decide that they want to spend the rest of their life in their own personal prison at home in order to extend the life which they want to protect. I mean, I don't really believe that that's how we're built. I think our need to interact physically with people is part of us, just as when I take my dog for the walk in the park, it immediately runs over to other dogs because that's the way its DNA has been programmed. So that was my first comment. Perhaps have a go at that one first.
Richard, I think you know me well enough to know that, you know, to make a point, I'll make an extreme example. I know that would be unfamiliar to you, but no, look, I agree with you. But the point I'm trying to make there really is that, you know, we're going to need to switch our brain back into the mode that accepts, you know, there is no such thing as immunity. You know, you can walk outside your house and something bad can happen to you. You know, you'll pick up a virus, you know, the sky will fall on your head, etc. And that's just normal life. And I think, you know, there's just a switch that's going to have to change in people's heads. And that switch is not because we have tracing, testing, and proof of health. It's for the reasons that you said, that people want to go out and smell the roses and talk to other people and just get on with their life. But I think, you know, people have, I mean, I'm sure we've all noticed it when we go out of the house, people have become a lot more sensitive, a lot more paranoid. People, you know, if they're on the same side of the pavement as you, they walk to the other side of the pavement. So there's something in our brains that is going to need to recalibrate. That was really my only point. And I was using an extreme example to make it.
Accepted. My other question was, would it be right to say that the real winners, and there's never really a winner in this situation, but the real winner of what is happening at the moment and what looks to become a new factor in the world, where hopefully we're going to be worrying more about what can kill us all globally than how one country can kill another country. So we'll actually somehow unify the world. But the real issue is, so the real winner at the moment, it seems to me, is technology. Because suddenly everyone's looking and saying, who can save us? Technology. Where are the experts? Where are the scientists? And that's quite dramatic for me.
Yeah, look, I mean, back to, I think, you know, the point that was made earlier, there's always been a role in society, you know, through millennia for technologists and scientists. And they've always played, you know, a critical and important role in moving society forward. But at the same time, you know, so have priests and rabbis and lawyers and doctors, and you know, I think in times of crisis, people look for answers from people who are, you know, theoretically coming at things from a rational standpoint. But again, I think that misses the point about science, is that, you know, at least half of the important science that we know is behavioral and is social and is soft science. And so, you know, definitely people see a role for technology, but I think, you know, that's been true for, you know, from the wheel and the printing press and the telescope and the ship and the car and the telegraph and, you know, electricity. And I don't think anything new or fundamental is happening at that level. I think, you know, technology has always played a role in moving society forward, but technology unchecked, you know, will never be a good thing for society. And technology without understanding you kind of the human impact, the human consequences, you know, it's not even that it's going to be bad for us. It's just we're not going to get the most out of it. So I think the best technology companies in the world and the best future technology companies in the world aren't just made up by scientists, they're made up with artists and scientists. And, you know, Steve Jobs sort of famously said that Apple was at the crossroads between the arts and the sciences. And, you know, I really hope that if we learn anything from this next era, is that we stop basically saying, you know, we stop sort of minimizing the importance of the arts, the creative industries, the social sciences, and sort of, you know, we put them all at the same level. And, you know, maybe Neil will be upset with me about talking about Camden again, but, you know, Camden, I think, has done a great job here with its schools. They've got something called a STEAM Commission that doesn't just focus on science, technology, engineering, and maths, but also on the arts, and take an integrated approach from primary, secondary, tertiary, FE, and onwards to say, like, you know, to be whole human beings, we have to take account of all of this. And if you look at technology companies that are succeeding, it's because they take design as seriously as technology.
Wow. Dare I say good night again?
All right.
Let you go. I'm not sure you're here anymore, but we're sending out thanks to you as well for your cameo role. But Saul, tour de force.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Uh-oh. Someone's turning the lights off. Yeah.
Yeah. Get the message.
Remotely.
Saul. Well
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. God bless.
Bye.